Here. All right. Well, we're live, and we're live on multiple channels. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back here to our Global Online Meetup series. We're here with Rancher Desktop. My name is Robert. I am your host. I am the head of community evangelism here at SUSE. And I have Jan and Nino, and we're talking about Rancher Desktop, one of my favorite tools. Before the show went live, we were actually talking about some of the direction of Rancher Desktop. And today we'll be talking about the, what is it, the 1.9 or 1.8? What release are we? 1.9 and some of the features for it. But without further ado, I'll give it a moment to introduce our guests, Jan Dubois and Nino. I don't know if I can say your last name without destroying it.
Just try it.
So, no, I'm just like, don't put me on the spot like that. Gentlemen, let's start with you, Jan. If you can give a quick, who are you? Where do you play on the team itself, and let us know.
Sure, I'm the tech lead for Rancher Desktop here at Rancher Labs SUSE, and I'm also, together with Gunnar, our engineering manager, providing the vision or feature planning part of it as well. So, but in the end, it's a very collaborative process. We all talk things through. It's just tech lead gives me like a final veto on saying, no, we're not going to do this, or we're going to do it differently. But yeah.
Got it. And Nino Kodabande?
Yeah, pretty close.
Oh, man, I was close. I was very close on that one. And from a guy whose last name is destroyed all the time. My last name is very easy, but people call it Sriracha, and so I make it a point to try. So I will work on that for next time. You know, you're on the not board, you're on the Rancher Desktop team. Why don't you give yourself a little bit of an introduction there?
For sure, yeah. So my name is Nino. I'm a senior software engineer at SUSE, currently working on the Rancher Desktop. And I'm mainly focused on the networking side of things. So that's the area that nobody else wants to touch. So
Yeah. I mean, and if anyone who knows me, I hate networking. I'm terrible at it. So I'm glad there's people like you out there who are doing the good work and working on the thing that no one likes, because it's networking. We have some slides. Who wants to share? I think Nino has them up.
Yeah, I just want to quickly say, it's not that nobody likes to touch networking. It's just that Nino is the best at it, right? So he's kind of owns networking on Rancher Desktop, but we have other people who contribute too, but he kind of owns that area.
All right. So we've, I think we can jump to slide 4 if you want to present, Nino.
All right. Let's do this. All right, so Jan, do you want to take over?
Sure. Yeah, I think we went through this already. I'm gonna give a brief overview on what is Rancher Desktop for those who've never heard of it. But then mostly I'm gonna talk about what's new in Rancher Desktop 1.9, the release that just went out before SUSECon. Nino is gonna talk a bit about the new networking stack that we have on Windows. Then we do a brief demo about these things, and afterwards, question and answers. We would like to know what you want to see in Rancher Desktop that we don't have yet. So if you can think about this a little bit, or if you have any questions. And yeah, that's it.
I think we have introduced ourselves. Here are some pictures in case.
Yeah.
All right. So let's see. What is Rancher Desktop?
You want me to continue? Rancher Desktop is a container management tool for the desktop. It's a developer tool. It's not a production tool. It runs on Windows, Linux, macOS, and it provides container engines, Containerd, Moby, to run containers directly, or you can use Kubernetes for your orchestration needs. And unlike many other tools like this, we support all the Kubernetes versions. So you can install any Kubernetes version, deploy your workloads, update to a later version, and see how this works. So you can kind of do a development test for updates or try compatibility with new releases, etc. And it has a graphical user interface, so it's can be configured through a UI. You don't have to do everything to the command line, but we do have a CLI tool, so most of the settings are configurable via scripting automation tool. So we use this a lot for our QA process. For all the automated testing we do, we use our CLI tools. So Rancher Desktop is like all SUSE projects, free and open source. Of course, we link to the operating system libraries. So there's proprietary bits from Microsoft on Windows and from Apple on macOS, but otherwise everything is free and open source. You can build it yourself. We build it on GitHub with GitHub Actions. There are no proprietary bits. We use a Linux VM on all the platforms to run the container runtime because containers only run on Linux. So we use WSL on Windows, and on Mac OS and Linux we use Lima, which is a Linux machines on Mac OS. And so you may be wondering why we need a VM on Linux, because we could run this natively, but it has the advantage that you isolate your container workloads. And the biggest advantage is you can just wipe everything clean by doing a factory reset and start over instead of having to clean it up inside your.
And honestly, that is if any feature people should know about Rancher Desktop is the factory, like the reset capabilities. Because when I was learning Kubernetes years ago, that would just take me forever to reinstall something. If I messed up, it was punishing having to go through that. And the ability just to hit one button and just have a cluster back up and running is absolutely just the selling point for me personally.
Oops. All right. Yeah. So as I mentioned, we support two different container engines, both Containerd and Moby, which is the Docker engine. They have slightly different capabilities. Containerd has some more modern features, but if you need a Docker socket for compatibility with other software, then Moby is the runtime to use. And Kubernetes is provided by our K3S distribution, which is like a lightweight distribution of Kubernetes, optimized for desktops, edge computing, anything where you don't need the full AWS cloud environment and all the drivers and whatnot for it. Yeah, let's continue on. What's new in 1.9? The biggest news in 1.9 is we have support for Docker extensions. That's a mechanism that Docker has created for Docker Desktop to allow third parties to implement extensions to their desktop environment. And they have published an API spec that we have implemented for Rancher Desktop so that we can run these third-party extension on Rancher Desktop as well. Not all of them work. The specifications are sometimes a bit missing in details, so we have to kind of go through each extension on Docker Hub, download it, try to install it, see if it works. If it doesn't work, go into a debugger and see why it fails. So we have a catalog of extensions that we have tested that we know that work, and those are built in. And I'm going to show this in a little bit. So extensions are published on Docker Hub. They are just OCI container images that you download and then you install them and use them. So some of these extensions need a Docker socket to work, and those obviously will only work with the Moby runtime. But a couple of them just use the CLI to interact with the container runtime, and we just use the nerdy control instead of Docker to talk to it. So we could make them work with Containerd as well, but that's a subset. So in addition to the built-in catalog extensions, our RD control CLI tool allows you to install additional extensions manually, but then of course you will have to check yourself if they are working or not. So this is still ongoing. We have someone actually going through more extensions and collecting the data. So this catalog will grow over time. So right now we only have 9 extensions in it that we have proven, and 6 of them also work on containerd. So then the next thing we did in 1.9, we have a bunch of experimental settings in Rancher Desktop, and before they were only exposed through RD control, so they were kind of invisible, and some of them were hard to set. So we've created UI for this. We'll go through the preferences screen in a little bit, but just to list them all, on Windows, we have the new networking stack that Nino has been working on. And on Windows, we also have a new proxy support that has been contributed by an external contributor, for which I'm really grateful that we get some traction of non-SUSE people contributing as well. On macOS, we have support for Apple's virtualization framework, on macOS Ventura and later, which is still quite experimental, but has somewhat better performance than QEMU. We have different file sharing options, 9P and for QEMU and VirtIOFS for the VZ set work. And we have a different networking backend socket VMnet, which is supposed to become the new standard for Lima on QEMU, but it doesn't seem to make a big difference. It's slightly simpler, so it should be faster, but in my testing isn't really much. So, and on Linux, we have also support for 9P. So, and the last slide I have here, deployment profiles. And this is mostly of interest to system administrators at enterprises. Deployment profiles have 2 sets of settings. One is you can provide default values for all the settings that will be applied the first time the software is loaded, so that you don't use the built-in values, and after each factory reset. And the other set of settings are locked settings. So some companies want to lock down settings like disable automated updates, or want to make sure that their users only use containerd and don't use Moby or whatever. So the administrator can lock down these settings. And then you cannot change them through the UI. So we've implemented 2 types of profiles. So administrators can define them. They will be stored in a location that will require root access on the system. And users can also define those. And all the administrators say, why do you bother with user-defined settings? We would never use them. But this is where Robert's point comes in. I found them very useful because I can define my own default settings. So every time I do a factory reset, it reverts to the settings that I want to have initially. So these settings are stored in the registry on Windows, property lists on macOS, or just simple JSON files on Linux. And for enterprise usage, they can be deployed with Windows group policies or with device management solutions or whatever. But most likely, if you're not an enterprise admin, you probably don't really care about this. And I think it's over to you, Nino, now.
All right. I thought I was just here to drive the slides.
Oh, it was you. I thought this was AI that kind of followed along.
All right. So thanks, Jan. So let's talk about the new networking stack for Windows in 1.9. As of 1.9, we have introduced the concept of user mode networking, and I'll explain what I mean by that and why have we decided to take this approach. So what it really means is most of the network operations, such as transport, protocol management, is now done in the application space, in the application layer in the user space, as opposed to historically when it was done in the kernel space. So why did we decide to do this? Is historically we had some, we encountered, when it came to networking on WSL, we have encountered some issues where WSL is not very easily configurable. And at times it could be clunky, sometimes it could be flaky. So there was a number of issues that we were facing. So for that reason, we decided to avoid relying on WSL networking stack. The big item that made us to come down this path was getting Rancher Desktop to work in corporate environments, where you have strict firewalls, you have VPNs configured, users want to access the resources in VPN, they want to pull their private registries, number of scenarios that Rancher Desktop kind of didn't work really well. And there has been a number of issues in our GitHub to demonstrate the community demand for this. So with this approach, there's no issues for Rancher Desktop to work in these kind of strict environments. Another big item was network isolation. So in WSL, by design, the network architecture is flat, and meaning that all the resources, network resources, are shared across all the distros. What I mean by resources, those being network interfaces, the IP tables, everything is shared across all the distros. So it was important for us to be able to have our own isolated network where we have a dedicated IP tables, where we can actually tear it down upon shutdown and then reconstruct it back up during the startup. For that purpose, we decided to introduce network namespaces where it creates that clear defined isolation for us. And then finally, consistent IP addressing. As I mentioned, WSL didn't really allow us for, well, it did allow us, but it was kind of clunky in terms of configuring the subnet IP addresses. It was pretty cumbersome. It wasn't very user friendly. And you can only imagine if there are other distros in WSL that user bring their own distros. Now changing the subnet address is just not going to be simple and straightforward. So for that purpose, we decided to be able to come up with a deterministic subnet address for our own virtual isolated network. So for the consistent IP addressing, although as of 1.9, this is always predefined, we are planning to expose this setting to the users. So in the future, let's say if some users are encountering address conflict, let's say between Rancher Desktop network and their VPN, they can actually configure their own IP address in their own subnet. But as of now, it's not configurable, but it's always consistent. How did we achieve this? So we have introduced this project called Rancher Desktop Networking. I have the GitHub link there. There are more details on the README. The README is pretty comprehensive. It talks about all the processes. There's a diagram there. But at the high level, what it really is just a layer 2 virtual network switch. The main processes that I would like to talk about is host switch, which acts as an upstream switch that runs on the host. And then there's a VM switch, which acts as a downstream switch that runs inside the VM. That's inside the namespace network inside WSL. And then the two communicate back and forth using vSock. vSock is, for those that might not know, is a POSIX virtual socket that allows in-between VM communication. It's not necessarily in-between VM. It's actually host to VM or VM to VM communication is done through this virtual socket. All right. How does it work under the hood? Basically, when the virtual network starts up, there's a virtual gateway that runs on the host. That is the host switch process. At the same time, inside the VM, you have the VM switch process that starts up inside the VM. Upon the startup, VM switch starts a tap device. It creates a tap device inside the namespace network, F0. And then once the two processes are up and running, host switch starts a handshake process. The handshake is just to ensure host switch is talking to the right process in the right VM. And once the handshake is established, there is a AFB-SOC connection created between the two processes. So that is the main communication channel between the two, the upstream switch and the downstream switch. So once the connection is established, the VM switch starts picking up all the Ethernet frames that it receives, that is received by F0. It encapsulates them, and then it forwards them to the host switch for further processing. If that sounded confusing, I do have some slides that I can kind of elaborate a bit better. So you can see here, we have the namespace network inside the WSL. So this is the new network that we just talked about. So let's say there is a command issued for curl to private.registry.org within that namespace. So what happens, of course, the packets are destined for F0, the tap device that VM switch just created. Once the packets arrive at F0, they're being picked up by VM switch. The VM switch then reads them as Ethernet frames, as layer 2 Ethernet frames. It then uses gvisor library to encapsulate these frames, the Ethernet frames. And then once they're encapsulated, they're forwarded over AFB-SOC to the host switch. The host switch, at the same time, uses the very same library, the gvisor library, to decapsulate the packets, the Ethernet frames. And then once they're decapsulated, again, it uses gvisor library to pass them over to OS kernel. And it does that through a series of OS syscall. At this point, the OS sees the traffic as a local traffic. It doesn't see the traffic as though it came from inside the VM. So it treats the traffic as a local traffic. So you can make some smart decision when it comes to routing the traffic. It can either route it to local interfaces like F0, or if you have any Wi-Fi interfaces, or localhost if the traffic is meant to go to localhost. In this case, it is destined for the VPN interface, which of course is going to forward it to VPN interface. And since the host switch maintains the connection both to the upstream network and the downstream network, it knows how to route the traffic back to the original destination because it maintains the both connections. All right, so with all that said, I'll talk about some of the ongoing work that is happening right now as we speak. So there are continuous improvements for the new namespace network. Make sure to ensure the full feature parity between the new network that we have introduced and the default network. So we want to make sure there are no missing features or we don't leave anything behind. At the same time, the user mode virtual network that we just talked about is also being implemented in Lima as well. So users can expect the same level of behavior between Lima and Windows. The network behavior at the minimum should be pretty consistent between the two platforms. That is the goal for us. And then to make sure the namespace network is default. If all goes well, we are planning at 1.10. I mean, Jan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think our plan is to at 1.10 to make sure the default, the new namespace network is a default network, and it's no longer experimental. So it will be graduated to default project. And another thing that Jan kind of mentioned, there is some experimental proxy that is happening, proxy work that is happening as of 1.9. Thomas Peral, I hope I pronounced your surname right, but he's a great contributor, external contributor that he helped to complete the experimental proxy work. So as of 1.9, users can configure their proxy on Windows, and in 1.10, we are also doing the same thing in Lima as well.
So I think one thing that I see missing here is I believe the new networking stack does not work from other WSL distros. The WSL integration is still outstanding, right?
For sure, yeah. And what
Yeah.
I meant is by the first item, the continuous improvement is there are some features that might not be available immediately. Of course, we are looking into those. One of them is WSL integration, as Jan mentioned. By the time the new namespace network is a default network, we ensure the full feature parity. So users shouldn't expect to miss any feature.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned it. So it's not going to become the default unless this has been implemented. But I hear you promised it for 1.10, so I'm happy to hear that.
Wow. Like you talk about putting someone on the spot. I have a question, if I can, real quick on the namespaces. Can you give a little context on what namespace we're talking about for the network? Is this namespace in the context? I think they're asking if this is context of Kubernetes namespaces or not, and I want to let you guys answer that one.
That's actually a great question. So the namespace that we have introduced is not really a Kubernetes namespace, but rather, I mean, the Kubernetes namespace are built on top of the same concept. However, what we have done here, we have isolated our network from the rest of the WSL network. So the namespace, you can think of the namespace as a borderline between the network operations. So when you are inside the namespace, you have all your own file descriptors, you have your own network set of interfaces, you have your own isolated traffic and dedicated IP table. So you can make sure you don't leak beyond your network, unless if you on purpose, you kind of create a bridge that make it leak outside. Other than that, you always stay within those boundaries. That's what I meant by the network namespaces.
So it's a Linux kernel namespace. So it separates the set of kernel objects into namespaces. So WSL already creates namespaces for everything else, like the PIT namespace. All the process IDs are local to each distro. It's just that I get some app always starting here. It's just that the network namespace was intentionally shared across the distros by Microsoft so that you can run a service in one distro and then connect to the socket in another distro, and you would have a connection, right? If they had separate network namespaces, then each socket would be local to that distro, and you would have to route through the host somehow and have some kind of network device on the host that would do the bridging between them, which is good if you want to spread things through multiple distros. But in our case, we want to be isolated, like everything else is isolated. That's why we create a Linux kernel network namespace.
Okay. So it sounds like networking for Windows. Was this like an entire, I don't want to say rewrite, but this sounds like a large effort that you guys put in to redo all of this, to put all this new functionality in within the Windows version of Rancher Desktop. Am I assuming that correctly?
Yeah, it was essentially a big effort that went into this. Previously, the default network, if you like to call it that, that was piggybacking off the WSL. We were getting a lot of free operations from WSL. So we were relying on the port forwarding from WSL, sharing the same IP table. What we soon realized is when you share the IP table with other distros, you could potentially mangle IP table entries that is being consumed by other distros or vice versa. So it was kind of important for us to create that level of isolation and come up with our own sort of network. Essentially, we started bringing the network into user space, and that's what I meant by the user mode networking, where we ended up writing a lot of the stuff in the application layer.
Awesome. All right.
Yeah. So, but the other important part was that with the built-in WSL networking, there were always issues with VPN setups for various users that could not be resolved with this, or needed extra tunneling work, because if the network connections originate from inside the VM, then you kind of have to duplicate the configuration on the host inside the VM, right? How VPN routing is supposed to work, etc. With the new model, we channel the networking through to the host, and the network traffic actually originates from the host, so it's automatically subjected to all the host configuration. So that makes it work automatically in a lot more cases.
Awesome. So what do we have next, gentlemen?
All right, so that was my last slide. It looks like we have some demos.
I love demos. Let's hope it doesn't break. We're live, so let's hope it doesn't break.
Demo.
Let's see.
So at this point, should I stop sharing my screen and allow Jan to share his screen, or
yeah?
Do I?
Yeah, let's do this. Let me try this here. Oh, I have to click on the window. So does this work?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so you should be seeing Rancher Desktop 1.9. Let's jump right in. Extensions, Docker extensions are hidden here. Under extensions, you see a catalog. These are the extensions that we have tested. I talked about this before. You can just install them.
I'm going to interrupt you, Jan, and you're going to get mad for me doing this. We got done talking Rancher extensions here back in April when we released that functionality on the Rancher platform. These are not akin to that. These are Docker extensions. So we want to make sure people are not confused with, we have extensions over here, but these are Docker specific extensions, correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So we do something with Rancher extensions, but I'm not going to talk about this right now just to avoid confusing people even more. Rancher extensions are kind of internal for our own usage, and Docker extensions are third-party plugins. Okay, so I'm just going to install, and it's going to be really quick to install it here because I installed them before. So you can see as I click on them, they show up here on the left-hand side in the menu. Each one here has a link, more information that goes directly to Docker Hub. So you can see it has typically some screenshots for the extension and some documentation on what it does. This is an extension provided directly by Docker. And then we can go to them here, click on them, and we'll see the UI for this extension here. So this is the Logs Explorer. You can view logs. I don't want to go into detail in these extensions because they are not written by us. They are not maintained by us. If there's a problem with them, we will not fix the extension. You will have to go to the extension author. I just wanted to show that how it looks when you have them running here. So disk usage shows you how the disk space is used inside the virtual machine. Each extension, as I said earlier, is in a container. So you will see we have these container images pulled into your VM so that we can actually install and run them. So we can remove them again with just removing. Or if you had installed additional extensions with the command line, you could also uninstall them here in the install tab. So the catalog only has like the built-in settings. I don't know, is there anything else we should show about this, Robert?
No, I think that's I think we've talked about some of the core forms and features of Rancher Desktop. I don't think we need to go into that.
Okay, let me go through the experimental settings then. They're mostly on the virtual machine. I can only show you the ones for macOS here. For Windows, we have to cheat later. So for volumes, we have the additional 9P and VirtIOFS. VirtIOFS requires Apples Virtualization mode, so I cannot select it right now. Networking has socket VMnet and emulation. If we switch to Apple's network, We have an additional option for Rosetta support, so you may be wondering why it's not always enabled, but testing showed that performance of the VM is actually about 10% lower when you enable support for ITIL binaries inside the VM, so you may not want to enable it if you don't have any Intel workloads, Intel containers that you want to run. And you can see now that I'm on VZ, I could switch to VirtIOFS as well. So for the Windows options, I have to go to the help for this, because the WSL tab only shows up on Windows. So there we have networking. This is the networking tunnel. This is the new stack that Nino has been working on before. And we have an additional tab for the proxy settings where you can configure your proxies.
So can I just throw in something real quick regarding proxy? So the proxy on Windows currently allows you to configure the users can bring their own proxy and configure it through this UI. However, one of the things that we are aiming to do is to auto detect system proxy. So if a user has a proxy configured on the Windows machine, you no longer have to manually enter it there. So Rancher Desktop will make a smart decision. If it auto detects one, it'll use that. If not, you can configure your own. So that's the current behavior I just wanted to point out.
Yeah, and there's another thing that we need to mention here is that currently, if you need to authenticate with your proxy, it means the username password will currently be stored in the Rancher Desktop settings file, which is stored in clear text on the host file system. So this is obviously not desirable. So we'll have to figure out how to store this in some credential storage on the supplied by the OS in the future. What else? I can maybe briefly show how the locked settings would look like. Let me see. But I can briefly show this, but it's kind of uninteresting. This is the property list file, and this comes from our QA test for locking down all the settings and changing them all to non-default values. So the locked settings are only applied when you start Rancher Desktop. I'll have to stop and restart it. This will take a moment here. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're not an enterprise admin, you probably don't care about this. So let's start it again. So you could see here it says auto start is set to true. macOS tells us that some app has added an auto start item. And when we go to preferences, or let me go back here, you can already see this here on the main screen. So you can see lock icons for virtually all the settings because everything has been locked down. So you cannot enable auto updates. You cannot change the CN. The same thing will go will be here. So all the settings have been locked and cannot be modified. As I said, it's useful to provide default values yourself if you want to. For factory reset, the only thing that I also find useful to lock down with the user profile would be allowed images. So you could specify which registries you want to pull images from. It's when you're working with Kubernetes and Helm charts, sometimes you don't know where a Helm chart pulls an image from. So if you have a company policy that says you're only allowed to pull from your company registry and some specific repos on Docker Hub, then you can put them all in here in the allowed images pattern, and then Rancher Desktop will refuse to pull images from anywhere else, just as a guardrail so that you don't accidentally pull images that you don't expect to. And I think this is pretty much it, what I can share here. Is there any questions?
Looking at the list here, I don't see any extra questions. So if we wanted to wrap this up, we are looking at support for Docker extensions, but not all of them. Those Docker extensions are not akin to our Rancher extensions, but we do have support for them for some of them, some not yet. Complete, I don't want to say complete, but a major overhaul of networking when it comes to the window and WSL2 functionality. And then a lot of functionality for system admins, or what we call them, desktop admins, individuals who can, deploy Rancher Desktop to your desktop for you, and then lock it down and kind of adhere to some company policies with that. I think those are our three major points with this release of Rancher Desktop. Did I miss anything?
No, I think that this is right. And just to expand a little bit on this, so I've been in several conversations with enterprise users, and often it's like a conflict between the users who want to use Rancher Desktop, and they have a security team that is very strict, and they say, no, you're not allowed to do this unless it can be locked down like this or that. That's why we added this this feature, because they would not otherwise be able to deploy this unless they can show that they make a good faith effort to lockdown settings that the security team cares about.
So it is a corporate feature, to say the least. It is a corporate feature, but it gives companies the assurances and the peace of mind of deploying it within their environment and allowing anybody to now use this, whether you're in a corporate setting or a personal setting, or even an education setting. You can use Rancher Desktop, and it's just kind of opening up Rancher Desktop to more corporate users with these changes coming through too. So, we've met the security team halfway, it sounds like.
Yes. I mean, this is for really locked down environments, right? So you have to realize that Rancher Desktop is a user mode application. You don't have to even enable admin mode. It's only like two parts. It's getting an external routable IP address that requires a sudo password on macOS, and it's creating the Docker socket in the default location. But you can create the Docker socket elsewhere and create a Docker context. Everything else is done in user mode. So any user who can download software could download and retarget it anyway. So I'm not sure what the big value of locking it down is, except, of course, as I mentioned, for images, it helps you to enforce policy that you don't accidentally do something that you're not supposed to do. But a lot of the settings, they don't make really sense to be lockable, but we made everything lockable because it's kind of just a consistent implementation. It's not implemented at a setting level, but we just have a general mechanism that makes every setting lockable, and then we don't have to worry about it, adding it every time we add a setting, etc.
All right. So as we're wrapping up, you guys know I was going to put you on the spot and ask, what do we look at? 2.0 looks to be the next release. What are we looking at? I know you're like, why you're asking. 1.9 just came out, and you're asking about 2.0. 2.0 is always a big. It's a major version. Anything in the plan? Anything you can give the community or people out there, like a nugget of just some vision that might be coming, that could be coming, some things that you guys are talking about on the Rancher Desktop team.
So first, we're talking about 1.10. We're not currently talking about 2.0.
Oh, man.
2.0, I know some people ask about 2.0. I mean, it's just numbers, right? To me, it would be like a marketing decision if you want to go to 2.0, but we are incrementally improving the project for each release, and I don't know when you want to make the big step. So actually, the very next release is going to be 1.9.1. It's a patch release because we have found two somewhat serious issues. One is in the deployment profiles that I just talked about. So if you don't use them, you don't care about them. The other one is in proxy settings, that we upgraded one module to a later version and that module has a bug. So if you use proxies, you could hit this bug. So we are in the final stages of testing, and we'll have a meeting in, I think, 2 hours to talk about our manual testing, if we are go or no go on the release today. And then 1.10, our typical cadence is about every 2 months, but it's not a promise, right? It's just a guideline. Sometimes if it's over Christmas or over summer, when people are away, we take a little bit more time. Sometimes we may try to shorten it a bit. So at the end of summer, we should have a 1.10 release. As Nino mentioned, he is going to work on expanding networking support, filling out the Windows version to get feature parity so that we can make it the default, looking into getting the same kind of networking working on macOS and Linux. And then another feature that I hope will make it into 1.10, but I'm not sure yet. So it's not a promise, but just a wish list item, is snapshot support. What we want to do is that you can save the current state of your VM. And when you messed up, as you said, your work, you don't have to revert with a factory reset to an empty slate, but can go back to a previously saved slate. This is interesting if you do, for example, you're testing upgrades in Kubernetes from one version to another. So you want to take a snapshot before you do the upgrade. You do the upgrade, you see something went wrong, you figure out what it is, you fix it, and then you restore to the snapshot, and then you do the upgrade again. The same thing is if you have an application that has a database. So you take a snapshot with the database content, and then you run through migrations to a new schema or whatever. You test it, and if something goes wrong, you can go back to the old state of the database and do it again. So that should speed up your development cycle quite a bit, that you don't always have to start from scratch. So it's kind of building on top of having deployment profiles allow you to change your defaults, but it also keeps your workloads around. So we actually have a first cut of the UI implemented, but the backend changes have not yet started. So, but we still have like 2 months until the end of summer, right? So we'll see.
Okay. All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for coming on, telling us what's going on with the latest with the Rancher Desktop 1.9 release. We'll wrap it up there and see everybody else in the community. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thanks, Robert.